Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Creating Business Impact from your compliance training, tips for maximizing engagement and performance without increasing cost. My name is Nicole Lanowski, and I'll be your host for the webinar. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Jeff Carpenter is the founder and principal of Caveo Learning, working closely with learning leaders and other senior executives of Fortune 500 and large middle market organizations to help them better align their learning investment to deliver measurable business results. He has more than 20 years experience in learning strategy, instructional design, and L&D departmental development and transformation. Sherry brings over 30 years experience in learning and media. She has a passion for the strategic approach to learning that is driven by value to the business. After years in the radio, television, and advertising business, Sherry brought her communication skills to the learning and development world and has created and managed learning solutions for global business and government. She has a particular focus in healthcare and is a member of the Healthcare Business Women's Association and other pharmaceutical, biotech, and learning industry groups. Sherry resides in Mystic, Connecticut with her firefighter husband and 15-year-old daughter.
All right, thank you, Nicole. What we're going to first talk a little bit about is Caveo Learning as an organization and what we provide to our clients. Caveo Learning is a learning consulting organization that has been in business now for 10 years. We offer our clients a wide variety of different services. However, we really focus on three core areas of learning and development. The first one is around strategic learning consulting, where we work with learning leaders to be able to help them better align their organizations to the business goals and objectives. And this is really through a lot of different areas, but we focus really on learning strategy and project planning. And this is organizational development, capabilities, maturity assessments, learning organization transformation, and change management. This is seen through our global transformation events, helping really put the plans together and develop content around that, as well as helping organizations put together the standard operating procedures, standing up corporate universities. The next two are more tactical in nature, so our learning and performance solutions is our instructional design teams, where we provide instructional design services, curriculum architecture design, developing learning paths, courseware design and development, as well as needs assessment and process redesign. And then lastly is around our training technologies, our e-learning, mobile learning, distance learning, our performance support tools, as well as our responsive design. So everything we do for within our organization is customized to our clients to make sure that we are driving true business value back to the business.
One of the reasons today that we're meeting with you is to discuss how we can bring that business value back to the business through compliance training. So we're going to review a little bit about how did we get here, how do you create that business case for compliance training, what the target audiences are, what are some of the issues with non-compliance, what can possibly happen that can affect that, and then really focusing on new approaches and techniques. We're going to talk about tactics and tools that you can use to start rethinking compliance training differently. And finally, we'll offer some examples of that approach, and we will open it up at the end for some Q&A session with Jeff and myself. So let's start out, Jeff, and tell us how did we get here?
How did we get here? So it may seem like as you look at the space overall around the regulation and compliance, there's a lot of thought around where it seems like it's been here really since the dawn of time, since the beginning, to really with all of the different rules and regulations that are currently in place. But that really has, you've seen that growth and that influx really over the last probably 40 years. Basically, I wanted to give you a little bit of a history around how we got to the rules and regulations that we currently have in place. So it really started, regulation that really existed back in the Greek and Roman periods as a way to really ensure that the weights and measures for trade were standardized, to make sure that everybody, as things started to kind of go globalize with the trade, to make sure everybody was getting a fair deal if they were exchanging goods back and forth. If we fast forward a little bit more towards modern times, you look at the 19th and 20th century, where compliance really began to take hold in those centuries. Many of the U.S. regulation agencies really began to create its own administrative laws and different procedures under its own authority. So this basically allowed industry experts, so experts inside their existing industry, to be able to focus their attention on specific industry issues. What this really did was it allowed them to self-regulate. So you can start to imagine with self-regulation of the industry, some of the issues that came up. So then you start to kind of tell forward to really unregulated business of the 1920s. So in the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, there was a lot of boom going on and a lot of self-regulation that was happening. But it was really in the 1930s where the earliest federal institution was the Interstate Commerce Commission. that was when the federal government was trying to really pull back in a lot of the state agencies, and that's when the lawmakers really decided that any type of unregulated business was really bad for the industry. So after the crash, they realized it led to a lot of injustice and inefficiency as to business. So business had to have some type of reins around it, some type of guidance to be able to allow them to function in a way that they felt was very positive and very good back to the community and society. In the 60s and 70s, the shift really started to shifted away from the self-regulation. So as you saw, kind of this trend of, we trust you to be able to self-regulate, to more of a regulatory capture. Now, regulatory capture is a form of political corruption that takes place. It occurs when a regulatory agency creates an act. It's supposed to create an act in the public interest, so it's something to provide good. And instead, the industry advances its own commercial or special concerns of interest group that really dominates the sector. So they're trying to really rein in a lot of the corruption that was going on inside the industry at the time. And this is when it led to the detailed regulation and compliance standards that we start to know today. So the EPA and OSHA were really the first ones, were formed out of that new approach in regulation. So 1970 is when the EPA came into effect, and in 1971 is when OSHA came into effect. So it wasn't really that long ago that some of these heavy agencies came into effect to really do a lot of the regulation. And it's important to know that in 2014 alone, you look at there were 75,000 pages of new regulations that was introduced by feds, but that's not even including the state regulations that are in place. So really the question is, how are you going to ensure that your organization is really in compliance with this avalanche of new rules and regulations? So as you look at really kind of as the regulations start to go up, we've seen this dramatic increase really over time. So it's important that you, again, to kind of keep an eye and watch those things. So with all the regulations that are going on and really the onus that's being put back on businesses, the compliance training really needs to go beyond checking the box, really beyond making sure that at the beginning of the year in January and February, everybody takes the compliance training and then you forget about it for another year. It has to be more integrated really in how employees and the business does its work on a daily basis, and to really make that a part of core of the business. It has to be sustained and reinforced throughout the year. And it can't be just the one and done that it is currently viewed as you go through the year, because things come up throughout the year, and it's important that to continue the compliance effort. It's not meant to be punitive. The compliance training is not a punitive thing. It's meant to really help the organization be able to better leverage itself and be successful as an organization. So you do need to lay in performance management efforts to ensure adherence to the policies and procedures. This gets back to the executive level and the management level to make sure that they are really on track, on task, to make sure that everybody in the organization is really doing the right things and doing the right things on a regular and consistent basis. Compliance issues also need to be meaningful and relevant to employees. So often you talk about what is fraud. Fraud means different things to different people in different parts of the organization. It needs to really be looked at as, what does it mean to me as an employee? How do I recognize when those types of things are going on? And what am I going to do, or what are the steps I need to take to make sure that I am in compliance and protecting not only myself, but protecting the organization? So we need to really take a look at what is the traditional thought of compliance in the workplace. There's a lot of different things that you have kind of circling around the business. So when you start talking about, well, why do we do compliance? Why do we do this whole thing? And it's really around risk mitigation, cost avoidance, business continuity. There's social responsibility that we need to do. There's employee safety and industry requirements to stay relevant. Each of these things are very, very important to the organization. However, those should be seen as a benefit to the organization, not as a threat or a punitive piece to the organization, because each of these things allow you to be able to better operate as a business. So you start to look at the business case that's wrapped around that. And it's also important to realize, there's a couple of statistics here that I'll put in, is in 2012, OSHA conducted a little over 93,000 inspections across the U.S. And it found out that there was over 200,000 violations and levied nearly $200 million in fines. And as of February 1st in 2013, the SEC collected $2.68 billion in penalties for people that were involved in the financial crisis. So you see that that each of these regulatory agencies are very active in what they do. The pharmaceutical companies alone, since 2009, have agreed to pay over $13 billion in revenue to resolve the Department of Justice allegations for fraudulent practices, So it's really important that as you look at this, it's not just something that you have to check the box on. It's something that you have to really get integrated into your overall business so that you stay in compliance, so that these fines are meant to really make sure that you understand the importance of how non-compliance affects your business. So you hear a lot about all the businesses being penalized for what they do. There's been a changeover to it's not just about the business anymore. It's not just about the senior leadership, where in SOX compliance it's about the CEO and the CFO and signing off on the financials that happen. But there have been new laws that have been passed that goes beyond the organization and really goes to the individual. So the individual, as an individual inside of an organization, you are exposed to noncompliance. So it is critically important that each individual pays attention to what's going on in the business to make sure that not only is the business in compliance, but are they also in compliance. What we have up here is an example of the risks that an employee would face if they were to engage in fraudulent activities, so in bribery type of activities when trying to get some type of a deal closed or a political bribe or some type of kickback or incentive. For an individual, they are exposed to imprisonment, criminal fines, as well as the cost of repaying that corrupt payment. So there are a lot of things there that employees need to recognize that this is not something where they just kind of click the next box, roll their eyes, and just try to get done as quickly as possible. That the organization is not only trying to provide or protect the organization, but it's also trying to educate and protect the employees themselves to make sure that they understand really what's important to them moving forward inside the organization. So there was a study done by Brandon Hall Group back in 2003 where it wanted to identify what was considered the most important learning programs across the organization. If you look at the second one in line there, the regulatory compliance, and then the second to last around company compliance, you pull those two together and it really ranks not just as the second, but really the most important issue above leadership development. For those organizations that are really accountable to the outside agencies, accountability is the most important piece of the overall training puzzle most organizations feel. So the compliance survey itself had 404 companies that were asked about which learning programs are most important to their business strategies overall. As you see here, from a business strategy standpoint, from an organizational strategy standpoint, it really ranks as the highest above leadership development, above specific job skills, above products and services, so the importance is recognized within the organization. Taking all this into consideration, plus the fact that 2/3 of companies in the survey said that they need to demonstrate learning compliance to an external agency that is either very or critically important, and the critical role of compliance plays is evident in what they need to do on a daily basis. So it's going beyond just check the box and forget about it. It's really now a lot of the agencies are starting to migrate towards you need to show that you're demonstrating the skill that you learned during these compliance training efforts. But the odd thing in here is that this training, regulatory compliance and company compliance are ranked the highest. It doesn't get the same kind of attention as other programs when it comes to the design, development, delivery of the other what are considered mission-critical items inside the organization. It's awfully boring, it's awfully dry, and it's almost seen as that necessary evil that needs to be done at the beginning of each year just to make sure that you can say that you've done what you needed to do, now we can go on and do, quote, real business. But it is very, very important that it gets the same type of attention that all the other parts of the business get for the strategic initiatives that are going on. So we talk about compliance training is really only a small part of the greater ecosystem that needs to be created to ensure compliance in the policies and procedures that are put out there. It takes everyone in the organization to actively participate to realize really what the true benefits of a compliance program can really offer. So when you look at it from the standpoint of senior leaders, they're trying to increase shareholder value, have business continuity, to mitigate the risk that is involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, to do cost avoidance and liability reduction. So to make sure that you're in compliance with a lot of these safety issues and making sure that employees are engaged in the process, it becomes very critical as from a senior leader standpoint when you're looking at your budget, when you're looking at your spend, when you're looking at driving shareholder value. It's very, very important that if you focus the energy and the efforts on the compliance and regulation training, it will help you drive money to the bottom line that could have been spent somewhere else. If you really focus on a lot of the OSHA compliance issues, it helps drive down missed days or days off or shutdowns or things like that, which really drives revenue down to the bottom line. From a manager's perspective, I mean, it really raises up employee engagement to make sure that they're active and engaged in the business, that they understand what's going on inside the business itself, to make sure that processes are adhered to. That is a big piece. So you start looking at, go back to the Sarbanes-Oxley, that is really to give transparency to the workflow and to the process and to things that go on there, along with all the accounting standards, but it ensures that everybody is following a very specific workflow. It's very transparent. It's very process-oriented as you go through that. And you really do have those clear expectations. So you can start to drive efficiency and profitability through those things. And of course, if the company is profitable, if the right things are being done, there are promotional opportunities that are available to both the managers and the employees. So when you look at it from the employee standpoint, they also have those promotional opportunities. They have the defined workflow and processes that they can follow to be effective and efficient in their job. They understand what's expected, how to do things. Things are well documented as they go through the process.
Thanks for that, Jeff. That's been very insightful. It seems like a lot of organizations are still limited to that read and agree type format, and I want to really talk about what the dangers are of that type of a format and why you need to start thinking of it differently. And really it kind of boils down to how the regulatory agencies are looking now for how people implement those regulations in their daily jobs. It's no longer just acceptable when the auditors come through to say, okay, here's our training record. We showed that these people took their training. They're actually going to people. They're going to them on the manufacturing floor. They're asking them, hey, tell us how you do this now. How are you implementing that SOP? How are you, executing on that regulation? Let's see you actually do that in your daily job. And if your workforce isn't prepared for that, it can have some significant impacts. And it's not just on the manufacturing floor. It's all the way up to the executive level. I'd like you to think about how many rules and regulations you encounter, and maybe just showing up to work this morning, from the caution on your McDonald's coffee cup of the hot coffee to, the correct usage of your airbag in your car as you're driving and seatbelt. You enter the building, authorized personnel, and you're seeing these instructions constantly. My favorite is a washing tag instruction that's been going around the internet, where it's been saying, okay, here, take this garment, wash it inside out, and it actually says remove the child before washing. So we're really going to the extreme about all the sort of rules, regulations, instructions that we're getting every single day encountered in our lives. How do we make compliance training and the rules and regulations that we have to communicate across the workforce, how do we make that different and stand out and give the learner the ability to retain that information? And as you saw on the previous slide, where it was ranked as the second most important learning program in the organization, how do you get buy-in to your executives that this is just as important as sales training, technical training, soft skills? And why do we make it sort of the most painful type of training that we're asking people to engage in? So what can we do to actually convert that to a business value? And what are some of the advantages of doing that? So think about encouraging a better workplace alignment. You can set the tone for expectations, standards, personal and professional obligations to not only your customers, but to your shareholders as well. These all have, as Jeff mentioned earlier, positive business impact if you think about compliance training differently. Also, you have this great burden to keep pace with industry changes. So you have a high frequency of change, and as a result, risk being out of pace with those changes, especially in industries like airlines and engineering and a lot of different agencies that are continually changing their processes and procedures. And then you have the ability to create a framework for making good business decisions. This can streamline your processes for employees to follow that framework to make good business decisions. Why not equip them and give them the tools to make those business decisions? If you rely on a solid framework, your employees will help you mitigate the risk of the organization in those terms that Jeff just mentioned, by not just corporate fines but individual fines as well. And then finally, you're going to begin to provide a transparency into workflow and financial reporting through better compliance training. You will be able to convert that into a business value through things like, hey, we increased productivity here, we reduced costs because we didn't inflict these fines. These are all giving you great transparency into workflow and financial reporting. And then the other issues around safety and downtime. I mean, think about greater standardization and conformity across the organization will help you put the processes and procedures in place. So it isn't just always a training issue, but better training can lead to you being able to improve processes and standardize and provide conformity across the organization. And then focusing on that employee engagement and satisfaction. If they feel like they're helping the company add business value, they'll see greater value in doing the training. It will provide more value to them if they're saying, I'm contributing to the bottom line by doing this training. It's definitely something that you can build into the culture of that training. How do you do that? Well, you've got to rethink the instructional design and your business approach to compliance training. You need to align it and integrate it. So think about instructional design needing to be integrated with business thinking, turning your instructional designers in your organization into business thinkers. And business thinkers always relate to things that are timely, relevant, meaningful, and actionable. If you give them those 4 basic step-by-step concepts when they're designing and developing, as they're doing the instructional design training, they can actually integrate those business thoughts of timely, relevant, meaningful, and actionable and check themselves against that as they're designing and developing their training. So what are some of those instructional methods you can use to drive those results? Let's talk about those different things. Scenarios, case studies, simulations, role play, hands-on labs. There are so many things available to us right now that we can do when building that training. And I know you're going to immediately think, I just don't have time for this. But really, if you think about it as a time shift, you do have time for it. If you think about the time and the money spent on all those things we mentioned earlier, you can actually do a time shift from those elements. So instead of doing training that's addressing deviations, you can actually do training to proactively prevent deviations. You can, and accidents and incidents and things that are jeopardizing your business. So if you think about it as a time shift, you really do have the time and the money to do that because you're not spending it somewhere else. And that's a really good thing to consider. And in order to do this, you have to not just spit the regulations back to them. You really have to make sure that when you're doing the training, you're making it learner-friendly through these types of interventions that make it a little bit more creative, a little bit more interactive, a little bit more engaging. The one caution I would have here, though, is to be sure that you don't change the meaning of the regulation when you're making it more learner-friendly. I know it's tempting to get into a more casual when you're wanting to address the learner appropriately, but make sure that you're sticking by what the meaning and the true essence of that regulation is as you're trying to make it more learner-friendly. So what are some ways that you can do this? Think about code of conduct, for example. Instead of just saying, here's our code of conduct, sign off here, okay, you understand that, why not put that person in a situational case? Have them actually use that situation to evaluate the regulation. Okay, how would this regulation apply in my situation? Option A, option B. Let me select the appropriate one. And then maybe in the end, debrief that scenario. And this is where you start to engage your management, your leadership. How do you get them engaged in compliance training? Because as we saw earlier when Jeff was discussing that ecosystem of the stakeholders and what's in it for them, not a lot of time is spent reconnecting on how are we implementing what we've learned in our daily jobs and have those discussions. So perhaps a debrief of that scenario. What would you do in this case? And then that will help them reduce their time spent on other things. For example, let's talk about internet policy. Most organizations now have internet policies in place about how their employees are using the internet. think about the fact that if you can implement that and actually get them to adhere to that type of compliance, how much time are you saving that they would have lost on personal interests? You're increasing productivity, so you're getting a business value out of that compliance training. The problem with a lot of compliance training is, what do you do about the gray areas? How do you address those things where there isn't necessarily a black and white, right or wrong answer? This is where we go back to that sort of scenario-based assessment of that. Use tools that are available to you today. We have some great online learning tools available like Articulate, Lectora, Captivate, Elucidate. A lot of these tools are available to you now to create these types of interactions to make a very engaging scenario where the person can actually select the most positive outcome, an acceptable outcome, or an unacceptable outcome. That might be the answers to those scenarios rather than straight true or false. Your only one answer can be the right answer kind of intervention. So those types of tools can be available to you, and I would encourage you after this webinar to reach out to us, because we can make some of those resources available to you as to where you can get some of those tools and some of the resources that are available for creating games, role plays, and other types of interventions without spending a lot more energy, time, and effort. And what does this lead to? Well, this leads to what I like to coin VBCT. So I call it value-based compliance training. And looking at compliance training with business value is really a great way to change the mindset. Think about it. You have to do it anyway. You're spending either resources or money or both in developing and designing and deploying it. You have a captive learning audience. Why not move away from just straight knowledge transfer into knowledge application and finally into business impact? And if you engage that learner, you'll increase their ability to comply with those regulations, policies, etc., as well as improve their own personal performance in their job and contribute to the overall performance of the company as well, or the organization.
The thing I think that's very important that a lot of organizations tend to forget about is sustainment and continuous communications. Those are three areas that are lost in, that we include in with all the other training interventions and the training events that we put into place, but it often falls very short, or it is one where people kind of do it half willingly, where they don't really spend the time that they should spend with their employees talking about these issues openly. How do you sustain these things moving forward? How do you include these in part of your regular communication rhythms, your meeting rhythms, so that people continually, if it's important to you as a manager, it will be important to your employees. If it's important to you as an executive, it will be important to your manager. So you have to be able to continually have the communication efforts that are put in place as well as the ongoing sustainment efforts.
Okay, thanks for that, Jess. And that kind of is actually a good segue into the next slide, which is talking about now tactics. How do you do that? Because everybody would like to do these things, but how realistic are they do in your daily design and development of this type of training? We have sort of a little bit of a checklist you can go through here in order to maximize the time that you might spend on rethinking this and changing it into value-based compliance training. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is review the compliance topic to even ensure that it's a training opportunity. A lot of times it might be just a process or procedure type change. Make sure it actually is a training opportunity. What is the outcome that you're trying to get? And the way that you do that is you think about what your terminal learning objective is. What is the outcome you really want from this training? What's important to have? And then to build up to that terminal learning objective, think about an enabling objective in order to get them there. So what are the actionable items that they need to do in order to achieve that terminal learning objective or that training outcome? What are the different steps that they need to take and that they need to learn? What are those actionable items like we discussed earlier? Also, you have to consider the target audience and their locations. Are these a dispersed workforce around the world that you might need to have more of a self-study e-learning type of intervention with? Are they in one location where you can gather them together and have more role plays, interactivities, labs, etc., that might be more beneficial to them in retaining that information and executing on it, and you can actually look for some things like skills performance measures that you can use in order to ensure that they're actually able to comply and do the task in the way that it's regulated. And then you can look for areas that might affect a job or a task's performance. If they're in compliance with the regulation, that means that the regulatory agency doesn't have to stop your work. Isn't that increasing productivity? Isn't that an objective? It gives you time to complete things and fix things and take them into your own power to control and be proactive with. And then finally, design and develop using those creative and proven instructional design methodologies. I think that's one thing that we always sort of get away from when we think about compliance training because of that consideration that it's just the check in the checkbox. So let's get back to some of those proven instructional systems design methodologies in order to do that. And we have done that in the past at Caveo, and we have some examples for you of value-based compliance training. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to just discuss some different approaches you want to take when considering these types of topics.
Sure. Thank you. So we have three different options that are up here. We have one that is more scenario-based, one that is kind of sustainment or continuous learning, and then another one that's really more kind of creative hands-on as we go through it. So let's start with the top left there around non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. That can be a bit of a yawner topic, but what we did is we really wanted to make sure that they could make it really so it affected their nervous system, so they could really tie it and bring it home. Asking them a very specific question around, if you experience this, if you see this, if this happens in the workplace, how are you going to react to it? So we want to make sure that they are doing the right things when they experience this. So we make sure that we can take the regulations that are there and really boil it down to a specific instance in which they could see this type of thing take place, and then what should they do to take action with it. So it's important that they can take theory that's out there or the rules and regulations that are kind of floating out there, and when you read them, they can be very nebulous. To boil them down into things that are really actionable to them, that are really something that makes sense to them, instead of saying, you know, here's an anti-corruption policy, and they're like, okay, well, I don't understand how I can be truly affected or how I'm going to see this in my daily work function. So it's important that you use those scenarios or those cases as part of what you do to really bring it down to an actionable item for them. The other is, if you look down to the middle there for the types of absences, typically what will happen when managers become managers is they get sheep-dipped or indoctrinated into all of the different policies and procedures and rules and regulations and everything that happens as they make their transition to management, if they're lucky, first off. But typically they won't run into that type of an issue, or very often run into that type of an issue. So it's important for them to be able to have a way that they can go and seek out the information and really get taught at the time of need. What we had done with the client for this is created a quick little 5 to 7 minute snippet or walk them through the most critical components of the issue. For this one, it was their leave of absence work policy, and it was so that they could quickly kind of get through that program, be able to understand what the action that they needed to take, what their responsibility was, who they needed to engage, and then at the end have the different telephone numbers, email addresses, forms, and procedures that they would need to be able to help them be able to execute that process quickly and efficiently, and who to go to when they needed additional information. The last one over on the right-hand side, where it talks about safe and secure work environments, you see the copier's on fire, is we had to figure out a way to be able to help the learners be able to understand on safety and security issues, or for safety issues, if they were to experience a fire, how to work something as simple as a fire extinguisher. It's something that most of us have probably never used or haven't used in the past, and really be able to have it as part of this. There was two parts to this piece. One is how to evacuate the building, to find two ways out of the building. We had a little game that we put around that. And then secondly was around, if you experience this and you can, it's under a contained thing that you think you can put it out with a fire extinguisher, how do you work a fire extinguisher and what's the right way to do it? So really being able to get those things down to a very actionable set of skills that they could leverage at any time.
One of the things we'd like to encourage all of you to do today is share with us what you might be able to do in terms of thinking about compliance training differently. So we'd love to have you communicate with us through either our LinkedIn or our Twitter accounts, and we'd like you to do several things as part of that. And so I'm going to challenge you a little bit today. I'd love for you to pick a compliance topic that's relative to your organization. I'd like you to go through and determine what that terminal objective might be. So what is the learning outcome you're trying to achieve? Then I would encourage you to develop a couple of enabling objectives that have that side benefit of improving the job or their task performance, and then link that back to the training outcome. And then finally, think of one creative way to help the learner apply what they've learned. Share with us what you might do in terms of an interactivity, a lab, a role play, some sort of engagement with that learner to help them internalize and retain that critical training outcome that you're looking for that relates back to that compliance topic. And we would love to hear your thoughts on that exercise and to see how long it might have taken you. I can guarantee that it doesn't take you a whole lot longer to do this than just spitting the regulations back to them. I can guarantee that if you start to think about this compliance training differently, you will be able to create learning interventions that are going to give your company and organization much more value than what they're currently getting through their existing types of training interventions when it comes to compliance training. If you're using off-the-shelf type materials and you're purchasing those through, libraries and that sort of thing, think about adding some small type of case-based scenario or intervention that will bring that generic type of learning more personal back to the learner. It will help them really integrate what they're learning through some of those tools. Oftentimes, we understand where budgets are. We understand where large audiences are, and you can't always take an entirely, completely custom approach. So if you have those types of libraries, I would encourage you to add to them with the types of learning interventions that we've discussed earlier, and I think you'll get much more value out of those off-the-shelf materials. One of the first questions we've received today is, what should my reply be to executives that say they do not have time for this? Boy, that's a common experience across all organizations. I've seen it over and over the years. And my answer to them would be, it's all about a time shift. So think about time spent here will reduce time lost from possible litigation, audits, shutdown of productivity, investigations. Not only that, those are some of the more negative items. Also think about the positivity of gaining time from things like increased employee engagement and performance. If you're getting more and better performance and productivity out of your employees, how much time do you think that's possibly saving you in the long run? So they need to see that value-based benefit of the time spent in good compliance training that will have a positive effect on their business and will actually create more time for them in the long run. So that would be one of the recommendations that I would make to that. And then, Jeff, we have another question that came in. Somebody would like to spend more time and money on creating better compliance training, but they've had a hard time making their business case. What would you recommend for their approach?
Okay, so actually I thought we did something on the washing the child and the shirt together, but I find that as a way of efficiency. Okay, so so I think from the business case perspective, it's a longer conversation to have around the business case, but I'll try to kind of put a fine point on it. You really need to focus on how it's going to improve efficiency and effectiveness inside your organization. Really looking at, you're going to be driving consistency, you're going to be driving a standard message to the organization, and by having people adhere to a more specific workflow or more specific process that they have in place, it will allow them to be more efficient and effective in the way that they operate. But then it will also, from a business standpoint, allow you to better assess how the workflow, how the data flow happens, so that you can identify errors or issues in there or ways to become more efficient and more effective in how you do what you do. That's kind of the short of a longer conversation. But it's really around efficiency and effectiveness, as well as making sure that you're doing kind of the cost avoidance. And that's not as sexy a thing to talk about, but it's really, if you look at the efficiency and effectiveness that you can drive inside the organization, having them rely on standard process procedures, that's really where you're going to get a lot of your business case from.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And finally, we have a question: how do you measure the business impact of doing better compliance training? So what are maybe some of the ways? I know recently I was having a discussion with a colleague in compliance training in their organization, and they were sharing with me that their folks really haven't put a big emphasis on actually measuring it from a business impact. So how do you start that process? What are some of the data points you need to start collecting and that sort of thing to show that better compliance training is actually having a positive business impact? Jeff, do you have any hints or tips there you can share with our audience?
I think you kind of, you sum that portion of it up.
Yeah, I think collecting the data, and that's what I see as the biggest challenge. Most people in organizations aren't taking the time up front to analyze, where they're at. With my healthcare background, I'm familiar with things in the pharma world, in good manufacturing practice, where they have deviations, and the FDA comes in and gives them a letter 483 or whatever, and they have to do certain things to fix those things. So maybe your business impact would be, have we reduced the amount of those letters that we get from the FDA? Where do you want to measure the business impact for your organization? I think that's a big first question to ask. And then how do you gather the data to do so? And then kind of take your milestones and benchmarks and say, okay, before we changed our mindset and our thinking around compliance training, this is how we were doing. And then since then, we've improved this. We've reduced our number of audits. We've reduced, some of these issues that we're encountering. And I think that those are great ways to measure the business impact of doing the better compliance training. That's about all we have in terms of a question that we have. So I would like to reach out and encourage anybody to reach back to me with any questions that you might think of a little down the road when you're actually executing on some of the things that we've talked about today. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. As I mentioned earlier, we have resources available to you as well, websites, tools, etc., that can help you maximize the time and effort that you're spending on making this compliance training better. So thank you again for joining us.